This podcast is dedicated to helping high achievers on the verge of burnout reclaim a healthier work life balance without sacrificing their growth or success. Welcome to episode 28 of Give Yourself Some Leeway, with me, your host, Eugene Lee. Today, I am honored to have Jim Young, the Centered Coach, as my guest. Jim is an executive coach, author, and professional comedian. And today we discuss Jim's most recent book, Expansive Intimacy: How Tough Guys Defeat Burnout, because it gives a more expansive insight into recovering from burnout. And Jim challenges other approaches to burnout recovery that maybe they're a bit too workplace oriented. Most of this episode, I decided to leave it unedited because it raised a lot of important topics. And while some listeners may find it uncomfortable about the topics that Jim and I discuss, I find that's all the more reason that we open discussion around these topics. So if any of the topics above in this episode didn't settle well with you, maybe it's time that we had a conversation about it. You can reach out at giveyourselfsomeleeway.com. On social media, on Instagram, you can find me at eugene.leeway or send me an email, eugene@leeway.ie. Thank you, and I really hope you enjoyed today's episode with Jim Young. So Jim, one thing that I always like to start off with when I'm talking to coaches is that we seem to follow a similar pattern when it comes to coaching, that we usually have this rock bottom or turning point in our lives. Yeah. And from that comes our journey of self-improvement and self-recovery. Mm-hmm. And then somewhere down the line, we get some spark or vision that leads us into coaching. So what was that like for you?
For me, I entered coaching. The first time I worked with a coach was from rock bottom. I had burned out of my corporate career. I'd been in burnout for probably 5 to 7 years before finally pulling the ripcord and leaving without a plan. I literally walked into my boss's office with a resignation letter and no plan. Within a few weeks, I hired a coach to help me figure out, how do I restart? How do I create a new career that's going to suit my life? So my first experience with a coach was from this place of really just having no idea what I was about to do and being, really at a low point.
So there, you hit a rock bottom, let's say in work, and was it only through work that you realized burnout, or did it affect like from my experience, it was at work that I noticed I hit rock bottom. I hit I started hyperventilating. I was having a panic attack, and I honestly thought my heart was failing. And I was I had to pull myself aside and be like, Eugene, you're 27, you're fit, you're healthy, your heart isn't failing. I was there. There's something else must be going on. Mm-hmm. So was it something that did you have an incident at work, and that was the breaking point? And you just went into your manager and started it then, or let's say that was your first step where you knew you had to start taking action?
I had actually had a couple of episodes prior to that day in the middle of 2018 when I decided I had to walk away from my corporate career. I had taken a month-long leave of absence for mental health, for burnout. In retrospect, I didn't know it was called burnout at the time, a couple of years prior to that. And it was a lot of factors. It wasn't just work. I mean, work was a huge factor in it for me. The cultures that I was working in, the amount of workload that I would take on because of my own insecurities or my own limitations. And I also had a lot of stuff going on in my personal life. I was losing a loved one, my grandmother, who was a caregiver for me. I had gone through a divorce recently, so I was trying to figure out how to be a single parent, how to live on my own. My social life had kind of been turned upside down. So it wasn't just any one thing. It was actually a really big collection of things that all felt like they were kind of crashing in on me. And for me, my response was do more, just try to outwork it. And I eventually hit a point where I couldn't do that anymore.
Yeah, I can 100% resonate with that. I think that was what I was in my down spiral as well, and I was trying to let's say run on autopilot so that I wouldn't have to feel that extra stress that I knew was happening in the background. That I just immersed myself more into my work because
Yeah.
I thought I saw that as a comfort that I was able to get that job satisfaction if I worked that little bit harder, and maybe that would compensate for the other stresses and responsibilities that I had in my life.
That's so familiar to me. I had this sense that I was failing in all these different ways in life, that going through a divorce is a traumatic event for anybody. For me, it felt like I had completely failed at marriage, at that aspect of manhood. I felt like I was failing my kids because of that. I felt like, my friends had kind of gone away from me because they didn't know how to deal with somebody who was divorced. They were all kind of, in the married family life, and it was uncomfortable. So I felt this sense of failure, and work felt good. I was I could do more. I was always a high achiever at work. I got a lot done. I kept getting promoted. So when I hit that, the rough patches there, I said, well, I'll just work more. At least I feel good there, until I didn't.
Yeah, I was kind of like, yeah, burning the candle at both ends, and it was fine, let's say, until you literally you're on your last, let's say, your candle just burns out, and yeah, I 100% can resonate with that, and it's something that comes up a lot, especially when people have like a high achieving background or they're motivated by achievement success, that they tend to compensate for other stressors in their life or other areas where they might feel that they're not up to their own standards, or let's say that they're feeling they're not perfect enough or good enough in other aspects of their life, and they try to compensate by overworking or overtraining.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a saboteur that I'm aware of, that lives in my head, and I call him the A+ student. And his job is to get an A+ on the paper before the teacher hands it out. Right. That perfectionism of it. If I can just do it right, if I can be perfect, then nobody could possibly criticize me. Nobody could see all the things about me that I worry about exposing, that I have an insecurity about something, that I'm afraid. And that drove me for so long, and it got me really far. I mean, perfectionism is a strategy for getting good jobs and good salaries and promotions to a certain point. I just think it's got a pretty short shelf life.
Yeah, and I think when it comes to perfectionism as well, um, like perfectionism is all a matter of perspective, where you think that you're trying to achieve 100% perfection in your project or in your job, but if someone else looks at it, that's not perfect in their eyes.
Oh,
and
I
and
used
and,
to
and
hate feedback. It was the worst. I would try and avoid anything that required feedback, because I knew deep down inside there's no perfection. Like that's a fallacy. That if somebody criticized my work, or there was somebody pointed out a mistake, it felt like, you know, it was horrible. I could not handle it. I needed it to be perfect.
yeah, and I suppose then when it comes to your burnout, once you had realized it, and let's say you went to your manager and you just said, look, I can't handle it anymore. Um, how did you start your burnout recovery journey from there? Was
Mm.
there, let's say, was that your realization that you needed to take the time to work on yourself? Was that the moment of awareness that you had to start your burnout recovery journey?
It was slow for me. It started with that month-long mental health leave, and I thought, great. I just didn't work. I rested a lot. I spent time with my kids, and then I went back to work. I actually got promoted while I was on that mental health leave, which is just the most ironic story. I got promoted to be president of this company I was working for in the last week of that mental health leave. It was insane, and I jumped right back in. So I short circuited all of that initial recovery work within the first couple of months, and then I eventually had to leave that job within a year. I went to another company because I needed a paycheck. I wasn't in a position where I could just leave. And I went into this other culture and I burned out there. It was ripe for me to burn out. And then I finally left. And what got me going on recovery was I had inherited some money from my grandmother, actually, who had passed a couple of years prior. And I said, you know what could I do with this money that would honor who she wants me to be? And I said, I'm gonna go off and I'm gonna go take care of myself. I'm gonna recreate my career. So I had this privilege of some inherited money, and I walked away and I stopped worrying about work for a while. I worked a bit, I did some contract work, but I really rested. I really took my time to assess what fits for me. How do I fit my work around my life instead of the opposite?
And so you had, let's say that was, again, having that opportunity as well to work on yourself, and choosing as well to focus on healing and recovering yourself. Where I know other people, if they inherited money, they'd be like, "Oh, I'm going to blow it on a car, or I'm going to
Yeah.
blow it on a holiday,"
Mhm.
and that's my best way of treating myself, or self-care in their eyes. It's
Yeah.
like splurging it on an indulgence.
Mhm.
Whereas you took the uh, opportunity to focus on yourself and your own self-development.
Yeah, I decided I could earn less money for a while. I could invest that money working with a coach. And I did things like I got in touch with what my life values were because I never had known what they were. And once I got clear about what my values were, I realized that I had spent 80% of my life living outside of my values. It's a huge stressor. And I then started to say, okay, well, how can I reframe success? Like, what would a successful career look like? Because to me, I worked in tech for 25 years. I was in senior leadership positions in organizations. I was climbing the ladder the way I was supposed to. I was making six-figure salaries. It all looked right on paper, and I was miserable. And I was like, well, okay, if that's what success was supposed to be, and I feel miserable, how can I redefine success? And for me, that ended up being identifying work that allowed me to be with my kids whenever they're with me. I have them half the time, and to do work that feels meaningful to me. The money is secondary to all of that. And I need enough to live, but I don't need to have status. I don't need to have a title. I want to really be, doing work that feels like it's fulfilling a purpose.
Yeah, and again, with that realization, and again finding purpose in that as well, it's really enlightening. And once you come to that realization.
Mhm. And it keeps changing, over time. When I first started my self-employment, my coaching business, I was a business coach. I was helping small business owners with normal day-to-day problems. And over time, I realized that's not really where my purpose is. That got me some money to get me through. And it's over time I realized that what I care about is all the disconnection, all of the isolation and stress, all of the burnout that's going on in the world, and in particular for men, because I lived that experience. I'm a dad. I'm a professional. I know there are huge responsibilities that go along with both of those, and they ramp up the expectations for guys. And so a lot of my work is to help men. A lot of them will come to me and they're like, I don't have a social life anymore. My marriage is in trouble. Like, all of these things that are supposed to be great in life are suffering because they're trying to meet this expectation. And so I really care deeply about that. And that's a lot of the work that I focus on now, which is different than it was 5 years ago.
Yeah, and I see you explore that in your book, your new book, Expansive Intimacy, because like a tongue twister to me,
Yeah.
Expansive Intimacy. And
Yeah.
I think one of the key takeaways that I got was that uh, you say that intimacy is the opposite of burnout.
Mhm.
Whereas from, let's say, on my journey, I always came across people saying that engagement is the opposite of burnout. So, what would you say is the difference between engagement versus intimacy?
And yeah, just to provide a little bit of additional context for that, I'm a big fan of Christina Maslach and Michael Leiter's work. They're some of the pioneers in burnout research, and they, along with some other colleagues, invented the primary assessment used to see if somebody is dealing with burnout. And they refer to the opposite of burnout as engagement. And I have a problem with that word because of how it's been used, at least in the US. It's been used in the corporate world in a way that says engagement is the best thing that you can possibly have. And oftentimes it looks like working a lot, like signing up for everything, being on all the time, working overtime. And there are absolutely positive aspects of engagement, engaging with other people. I think there's a higher level, though. I think intimacy is a word that we shy away from, but it's a deeper form of engagement. It's when we really open ourselves up to be our full selves with the people in our lives. And I called it expansive intimacy because we think of intimacy as this narrow concept. It's something that we have with a romantic partner. It's a sexual relationship. And there's actually intimacy available in every type of relationship we have, whether it's with our colleagues, whether it's with our kids, with our friends, with a romantic partner. There are different types of intimacy to use appropriately in each setting. When we open that up, life gets a lot easier.
Yeah, yeah. I think that was just something that I hadn't covered before. That I was like, was intimacy something different entirely to engagement, or was it just a deeper level?
I think of it as a deeper level. I think I could be engaged with you and we could be having a really good conversation about some intellectual topic without revealing anything about ourselves. And so I could be engaged, but not intimate. If I'm intimate, I'm going to let you a little bit in on what I care about or why this matters to me. Or, I'm going to get interested in you as well. There's this equal exchange of getting to know the other person. And I could be engaged in a lot of ways that don't open up access to who I am to somebody else. Because when I can do that, you get to see my struggles and my dreams and my longings, and I get to see yours. And that's a much deeper bond that we now want to support each other in deeper ways.
Yeah, and I suppose it's when I start thinking of burnout, I always think of uh, how to deal with burnout in the workplace and how to deal with stress in the workplace. So, how would you implement intimacy in the workplace?
Starting with leaders and managers, creating the conditions where people can share what's really going on. So if I could bring my full self to work, if I could rewind 7 years ago and I could see, what was going on, I could feel safe enough to share with somebody that I was in real trouble, like I was suffering. That would have changed the whole game for me because I might have still been at that company. So it's a lot of it has to do with creating psychological safety, and that's a culture a culture shift for some organizations of saying we're not just about meeting the bottom line and getting the job done. We're about taking care of our people and knowing that meeting revenue goals and keeping customers happy is actually going to happen when we do that. So it's really a shift in opening up conversations, making it safe for people to share more about who they are and what they're experiencing on a day-to-day basis so that we can get to know each other better and see when does somebody have all the energy and they can just go versus when does somebody need to throttle it back and they have maybe they're taking care of a sick relative at home and nobody knows about it. And people are wondering why aren't they performing well? Well, if we haven't made it safe enough for them to say, yeah, I'm dealing with a sick relative, I can't really show up like I usually do. Can you guys help me pick up the slack without feeling threatened? So it's a big change. It's a culture change, but I think it's also just, if we just turn up our humanity a bit, it helps us get there.
Yeah, because I've come across let's say some managers' approaches where they're a bit more cutthroat, and they feel that by being, let's say, cold and cutthroat and to the point and very all about the bottom line, that the focus is on the bottom line, that
Yeah.
people don't take it too personally, and that the focus on work, leave home life at home, and it's that disconnect I feel, is kind of what starts the burnout in the first place, because you're dedicating, sometimes more than half of your week hours. Like, I'm sure, yeah, if you're working Monday to Friday, you're dedicating most of your week to work. So work is a major part of your life, yes. And if you're dedicating all that time to work, you if work doesn't take into account that you have a life outside of work as well, and that you do have commitments and responsibilities outside of work, then it's very easy for that disconnect to happen between employees and management. So when it comes to trying to implement a more intimate culture from the top down, what kind of conversations should managers be having, let's say, from the top down, and
Yeah.
from managers to employees? What would be the main, let's say, topics or subjects, or how should that manager approach employees to
Mhm.
see how they're getting on?
The first thing I'd say is that it has to start really at the very top of the organization. Because if I'm a manager in an organization and the rules have been set that I have to meet certain financial targets in order to get promoted to the next level and earn more money, then I'm going to do whatever it takes to get there. And senior leaders define that structure so that whether that's a CEO, an owner, director level, that level of the organization really needs to set the tone. I'll give you an example. I've got a client that I've been working with for a better part of the past year who's going through burnout, and he's the founder of his company. His employees look up to him immensely. They think they think he walks on water. He's a really smart, really driven guy, and he hit burnout, and his organization was showing signs of it as well, that it was affecting a lot of people in the organization, this culture of really driving hard, really working a lot. And what we did was we talked about what are the conversations he needs to have to make it okay for other people to say, I'm not doing all right here. And what he did was he has a quarterly all company meeting. He got in front of his staff several months ago, and he shared with them vulnerably how he had been doing some work with a coach about his burnout, that he had gotten to a place where he couldn't show up well for his family, that he was dealing with way more stress than he could really handle. And he shared some other deep personal stories that helped people see that he wasn't this godlike figure, that he was struggling as well. And that conversation, him sharing a story and saying, I recognize that there's a need for me to change, and I want to make sure that nobody else is dealing with this, sent a huge signal to the organization. And they're now on a journey to start redefining what their culture is and looking at how do we create the conditions where somebody can show up with their story, and how do we have a team that's resilient to pick up the slack when somebody else is struggling like that. So I think it starts really at the top, and it's about being as vulnerable as you can, um, and saying like we want to do it differently.
Yeah, and I think even just listening to that as well, that when it comes from the top down, even if it's something as let's say that the top manager sharing something like that and being more honest and open to the employees, that it has a compounding effect. Let's say it
Mhm.
starts with that one person, and it makes its way down the chain, down the line of command, or the chain of command.
Yeah.
And once let's say once it gets down to the bottom line or the production level, that when if people are more open about their experiences, and the feedback that they get, even just the feedback that they can get from the bottom line, if people are more open and honest about their jobs and their
Mhm.
struggles, that can add more to the bottom line in the end, if they can understand what's actually happening with their employees. Because a lot of the time they say, oh, the employees come first, and we care about, of course we care about your employees and their jobs at the end of the day, but they're really only focused on the bottom line and looking at KPIs and looking at
Yeah.
where they can cut costs. But if they took in where people are struggling, maybe even looking at it from a quality and performance point of view, because let's say that's my background, my job.
Mhm.
You'd be looking at places where people feel that they're struggling at work, and it's like, okay, how can we make this better for them, so that they don't have to cut corners and make mistakes trying to keep
Yeah.
up with the workload that I'm throwing at them.
Yeah.
And by actively listening to that feedback, and being open to connect with employees further down the line, rather than literally just throwing at them, you're not performing up to standard, and not listening to them when they say that the standards are unrealistic, and just being as cold cut as that, being like, you're not keeping up. If you're struggling with it, that's life. Get on with it. It's just, the more I think about it, it's kind of like I'd almost be blue in the face from being like, can you not just have a decent conversation, like
Yeah.
like a human to human conversation about what's realistic, what's unrealistic.
Yeah. I mean, that's an intimate conversation,
Yeah, it
perhaps
is an
even,
intimate
right?
conversation, and it sounds like common sense, but again, that's what we're dealing with.
Yeah. Yeah, the other irony in there is that if you look at some of the statistics, and I'm not one of the people that can kind of quote them readily off the top of my head all the time, but there are some crazy statistics about how much productivity is lost in the global economy because of conditions like burnout, mental health challenges that people are having that are going ignored and untreated in the workplace. And it's like trillions of dollars a year for the global economy. So if we think about, bring it down to the ground level at an organization, you have an employee who's burning out, they calling out, sick more often, they're not showing up to work. When they are showing up to work, what's their actual productivity? Do they end up leaving and now you have to fill that role? And the cost of replacing an employee can be anywhere from 50% to 200% of their annual salary, depending on what the job is. It's like we're shooting ourselves in the foot by saying, just keep pushing harder, ignore the burnout, tough it out, because ultimately those people are costing you a bunch of money. Giving a little bit of time to say, hey, how can we do this differently? You might actually get more out of you. I firmly believe you'll get more out of them. And you might find, oh, there's a whole other way we could be working that people are healthy and happy and we're doing better. We're exceeding the bottom line goals.
Yeah, definitely. Like it almost, again, it's just like when we're having this conversation, it sounds like common sense. It sounds like, why isn't this common practice? And
Mm-hmm.
and it's, I don't know whether it's just maybe Western culture and our focus on productivity,
Mm.
and focusing on the bottom line. I don't even know if it's just a Western culture thing. But again, it's just from my experience, I seem to
Yeah.
think that it seems to be a Western culture thing, because that's where the burnout seems to be happening, or from what I have seen, or experienced, or have researched.
Yeah.
But is it just a cultural thing that we have, let's say, that we've gotten from the industrial age, or it does it go further back? I'm not sure.
I think it goes deeper, and it's in a dynamic that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. I think a lot of people actually shy away from it altogether. I think it's shame. And that was one of the things that surprised me as I was writing my book. Was I was researching, what is it that gets men in particular into burnout and keeps them there? And I realized it was shame. It was that we have this standard that's been set of what achievement looks like, of what performance looks like, what success looks like. And if we don't attain that, we're weak. We're not manly enough. And that's shameful. So we're going to work our asses off to make sure that we can meet that standard. And we're going to live by a set of rules that say, okay, on the way to being successful, you have to always be in control. You can't ask for help. You can't share your emotions with anybody else, especially another guy. And that's a recipe for shame. Like, I have to hold all this stuff in. I can't tell anybody about the things that I feel inadequate about, or I'm afraid of, or uncertain about even. I just have to keep going. And if we're looking at shame as a factor, I think we start to see that A, everybody has it, and B, the only way through it is to talk about it.
Yeah, 100%. I guess, yeah, that shame, it's almost, uh is it generational, or let's say, is it Is
Mhm.
it passed down from our parents and our grandparents? Is like the expectations that the society has put on us, and that is that why we have this inset shame?
I think it's diffuse. I think it's generational. There are expectations to live up to the standards of a father, a grandfather, a parent, aunt or uncle, whatever. Um, the previous generations and what they were willing to do, to sacrifice, to achieve. And it's also in the culture every day. We see all of the signs that define for us what does success look like. We also hear it growing up in the locker room, when we go through college or get into the working world. We see it in social media. Like, all these messages are telling us how we're supposed to be to measure up. And the second that we don't measure up, and I'm speaking again from a male perspective, is like, we're going to get called names. If we say we need to take a break, we can't, continue with the workload that's going on, we face a slew of names we don't want to be called, right? Because we were called those on the playground as a kid and we didn't like it, and they were shameful. And so I think it's happening all over. There's so many influences that tell us that in the culture.
Yeah, definitely. And it's something that I've come across. I came across one example. Someone reached out to me that they couldn't keep up at work, and they said they approached their manager about it, and they said, "Look, it's like I have so many projects going on at the moment. I don't think I'll be able to complete this one in time. Can I get an extension on the deadline, or can I delegate one of these projects to someone else on the team?" And the manager pulled them aside and said to them, "Is it because you think you're incompetent in your role? Do I need to move you?"
Wow.
And it shocked me because I was like, no manager should ever approach their uh, someone in their team and say, "Or are you incompetent in your role?" Rather than saying, "Where's the struggle? Where can I help you? Can I delegate someone to help you on this project?" That should
Hmm.
be the first approach. Is where, as a manager, how can I support you on my team?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I started speaking openly about this. I was like, how dare a manager call someone on their team incompetent just because they had the guts to speak up and say that they weren't confident that they finished a project in time. It wasn't because they're being lazy about it. It's because they care about finishing that project um, either to perfection or to a good standard, that they
Yeah.
looked for help.
Hmm.
And I spoke openly about it. I was like, in no circumstance should a manager call someone weak or incompetent
Yeah.
because they're looking for help. And when I spoke up about this, someone approached me and said, "How dare you talk about me on your podcast?" And I was like, "I have no idea what you're on about." And then they were like, "Yeah, I had that conversation with my manager. How did you find out about it?" And it took me back. I was like, "Okay, I wasn't talking about you, but I'm even more gobsmacked that it wasn't a one-off manager." I was like, "Is
Hmm.
this in management culture? Has it been passed down from the top down? Are they
Yeah.
actually using words like weak and incompetent to talk to managers down the chain of command, and they're passing that again down the chain of command again to employees?"
Hmm. Hmm.
It shocked me.
Yeah, that's striking. I mean, that's the absolute opposite of psychological safety, right? Is I cannot show any sign of weakness, or I'm going to have my job threatened, and I'm going to be called names by somebody who's got more power than me. That's a toxic culture, and I know that word toxic gets thrown around a little bit too loosely. Perhaps it's taken on a life of its own, but that's literally toxic to our systems when we live in an environment, we work in an environment where we have to be that careful that, when we have a real need that's coming up for us, we have to hold it back because of a threat that we might face.
Yeah. Um, I suppose again, on the topic of intimacy around men, um, even let's say outside of the workplace, do
Mm,
we need that connection? Let's say I know a lot of, let's say, Instagram groups and stuff where they're talking about kind of the tough guys and the alphas, and they're looking for brotherhoods. I think that's
yeah.
like kind of the start of where I've seen, instead of the lone wolf
Hmm.
mentality, and being the alpha and kind of and walking alone and all this and going solo. There's been more emphasis on making a community, like a male community or brotherhoods, and engaging.
Yeah.
Is that an aspect of the intimacy that you talk about in the book, where you feel that they're networking, or is it something different?
Yeah, for sure. The reason the subtitle is How Tough Guys Defeat Burnout, tough guys in quotes, is that we do need that across our lives. And it's not tough to isolate. It's not tough to just man up and grind through stress all the time on your own. And been some studies. Gallup in the U.S. has done this set of studies in recent years on friendship. They repeat it every 10 years, and the most recent version of it was released, I think, in 2021, and they defined it as a male friendship recession. That there are so many men who have zero close social contacts, close friends to rely on, and we need that in our lives. A lot of, I think it's a third of men have 3 or fewer close social contacts, and when you have 3 close social contacts, you're just as lonely as when you have 0, according to the studies. So we need to have people in our lives for when things are going on, and it could be, our friends who we get together with to let off steam. It could be, I've got a hard thing going on, I want somebody to talk to who can relate to me. And if we take it all the way back, I mean, we're tribal beings. We grew up in circles, and men's circles have existed forever. And we've gone to this place where we're isolated, and we're like, oh, well, I'll go on Instagram and I'll check out a group there and I'll read some messages, but I'm not actually connecting with another person.
Yeah, and another thing when it comes to those groups, like a lot of people search for that connection and they
Mhm.
join sports teams, or they're still friends with guys from college, but the relationship is very superficial,
Yeah.
and it's like they hang out with them because they're looking for that connection,
Mhm.
but it's all very surface level, and the only time that they ever, let's say, might exchange anything, let's say, a bit more intimate or personal, is if they're going to a bar and having a few drinks, and
Mhm.
it's only emotions that are, let's say, even if it's physical touch, or let's say hugging, or just talking about personal experiences, it only comes out while they're like under the influence of alcohol, or on a night out.
Yeah.
And they feel that they can't approach someone else in the group
Yeah.
unless they're in that state.
Mhm.
And I find that very, let's say, it's disheartening if if that's your social circle and that's your maybe 3 to 5 closest contacts, that if you feel you're in trouble, you can't reach out to them
Mhm.
unless you're on a night out in the bar, and you're able to express your emotions. Then you don't feel comfortable maybe reaching out to them at 8 o'clock in the Monday morning, being like, I'm not in the right mindset, I don't know what to do, I need help.
Yeah, and there may be topics that are always off the table with that group that you can't talk about, something that you're worried about, because they'll say, come on, you know stop being such a fill
Yeah,
in the blank, right?
and man up is one that's definitely thrown around. and
Yeah,
and and,
and
and it's just they're like, you're searching for help,
yeah,
and and
and it's
and
this
and for
denial
some,
of
yeah.
our emotional, like, realities. Like, we all have emotions, and somehow Western culture in particular has gotten this crazy notion that men aren't supposed to have emotions. We do. Like, we can't do anything about it. We can stuff them down and we can ignore them, but what that does literally to us is kills us. Those emotions live in our bodies, they build up stress. And if you look at the stats on male addiction, suicide, depression, divorce, all of these terrible outcomes that we want to avoid in life, that are stress driven in most cases, they're way higher for men. And especially as men reach their middle age years, when they've been holding that stuff down for so long. Like, that's not tough. Like, you want to be a tough guy and provide for your family, and you're doing it by avoiding any difficult conversation or sensitive topic with anybody, and you end up, dead of a heart attack at 55 years old. That's not tough. You've abandoned your family.
how do you find, if you find yourself in that position where, let's say, you don't have that close network of friends, or contacts, that you can have that intimate connection with, um, where would be the first place to reach out if you were to look for someone, to look for that tribe, for
Yeah.
that someone, for that deeper relationship, without, like, it can be when you're in that. I know I feel like I'm just trying to find the best way of putting this sentence together. It's like when you're in such a vulnerable state
Yeah.
that you know you can't reach out to your closest 3 to 5 people in your network,
Mhm.
to discuss, have those intimate conversations, and you're just in such a vulnerable state that, you don't know what's the best. Do you look towards, your sports group? Do you look towards your college friends? Do you look towards, maybe your church group or something? Um, where's the best group, um, to reach out to try to initiate that first intimate conversation? Or do you reach
Mhm.
out to a family member? Is is there any specific group that, is probably the easiest to have that intimate relationship with, or intimate conversation with?
I think it's going to vary depending on who you are and who your social circle is. It could be any of those types of people that you named. It could be a minister at a church. It could be your boss at work. It could be your best mate. It could be your cousin. There's no right or wrong answer there. It's who can I trust to share what's really going on with me? And that's critically important, is to know, like, I can trust this person to not use it against me, because that's just going to deepen the shame and it's going to send you backwards. And sometimes people don't know where to start at all. They can't identify a single person in their life that they feel safe sharing what's really happening for them. And that's a good time to start looking for a professional. Go see a therapist, hire a coach, people who are going to, by agreement, by contract with you, listen without judgment, support you, and help you identify, here's some strategies that you can use to now start finding the resources in your life. And it might be that they're new people, the new connections that you might need to make. Not always, but I think, really looking for, where can you find a trusting relationship where you can start to share who you really are, who you really want to be, what's holding you back, so that you can stop pretending everything's okay.
Yeah, I think that's probably a better way of phrasing it, is what questions do I need to ask myself? Because often we already have the answers within, we're just not asking ourselves the right
Mhm.
questions to get those
Yeah.
answers. So it's like, what conversation do I need to have with myself if
Hmm.
I find myself in that situation where I feel like I don't know who I can reach out to or who I can have that conversation with? Maybe it's something that, let's say, if you had an argument with your spouse and you wanted to reach out to someone else and talk about what's really troubling you,
Hmm.
but you're not sure which way to reach out. Do you reach out to a family member, or do you feel that there's someone that's going to hold it against you if they don't agree with what you say and they side with the spouse in the argument?
Hmm.
um, and that you feel that you're conflicted, or that you're just stuck in a rut.
Yeah.
And it's like, do you have a conversation with yourself to say, like, who do I ask that, that who do I feel that won't judge me for it, or will, actively listen, even if it's just a matter of venting? Sometimes we just need to vent, and we're not
Yeah.
looking for advice from that person. We just need someone to be there so that we can, to actively listen while we vent. And sometimes while we're venting, we come up with the answer ourselves, or we come up with the
Hmm.
solution ourselves.
Yeah, just talking to a lamppost, sometimes we can
Yeah.
come up with an answer. But I think you're onto something there of, what are the questions I need to ask myself when I'm in a situation like that? And what do I want from somebody? What do I need from somebody? Am I looking to just vent to somebody, just share my story out loud so I'm not living with it by myself? Do I actually I'm looking for some advice from somebody? Because one of the other things that can get tricky in there is, you just want to vent, you just want to share and have somebody say, like, oh wow, that sounds rough. Just show empathy for you, validate that, like, oh man, that sounds like a really hard situation. And if that's all we want, but then somebody comes in to try and fix it for us, that can feel worse. It's like, oh, well, have you tried? Why didn't you? And now we can start to feel like, well, but I wasn't asking for that. Maybe you already tried those things that they're offering as solutions, and you're kind of feeling dumb now. And so having people that know how to have those conversations with you, and also knowing what conversation you're asking for, is important. Like, what do I need right now? I just need you to listen to me.
How do you have that intimacy with your family and maybe your kids or your spouse? Is there, of course, there's different degrees of intimacy when it comes like your expansive intimacy. Of course, you have different approaches when it comes to your workplace, your friends, your
Yeah.
family. Um, but let's say if you're feeling burnt out, which of those three areas would you start with?
Oh, I don't know if there's a right answer to that. I think if you're feeling burnt out and your family is the safe place to go to talk about that with, and your kids might not be the right people to talk to about your professional situation, but maybe your brother is, or maybe your wife is. Um, yeah, I think it always just comes back to, for me, like, where do I feel like really closely connected to somebody who can help in this situation? Obviously, if you got an acute issue with, you have this ongoing issue where your manager is is calling you names, calling you incompetent. Well, is there somebody in the organization you can talk to about that? Maybe not. Like, if the culture is really unsafe and that's what all managers do, you go to talk to human resources and they're like, yeah, what do you expect? That's how we manage, right? You're not going to get what you need there. So you may need to go outside and talk to, a friend, a colleague at another business. It's like, hey, I don't know how to respond to this, you know. And again, like, what are you looking for? You're looking for advice. You're looking for somebody to just listen so that you can kind of process it through your own mind.
Yeah. I suppose then the other aspect of like when we think of intimacy, it's people usually think about touch and physical touch. It
Hmm.
and of course when it comes to the workplace, like you can't, it's especially as like as a man, you can't, let's say, um, the only physical touch you really have with anyone in the office or the workspace is probably a handshake.
Yeah.
And there's no like you can't even, let's say, pat someone on the shoulder or anything without some people taking offense,
Hmm.
and you someone reporting you. It's a very sensitive issue or sensitive
Yeah.
topic. um uh, so I suppose, yeah, one element that we have covered about intimacy is having intimate conversations. And I suppose,
Hmm.
is that as far as it goes when it comes to the workplace? Is that the safest route of having intimacy in the workplace?
In
Like
the
you can't
book, I
really go into
break
the physical
down.
side of things, or
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
yeah.
With maybe some rare exceptions, and I don't even know what they are. Physical intimacy, sexual intimacy, they don't belong in the workplace. Um, but there are a whole range of intimacies that we can use. I think this is one of the critical things that is just not talked about enough, not well enough understood, is that we can create intimacy physically and sexually. And those are the two that we primarily think about. But we can also create it intellectually when we're debating ideas and we're getting interested in what each other believes. We can create it spiritually. And in the workplace, again, that's something that's not necessarily always the right. It's not welcome to bring religion into the workplace typically, right? But you could start every meeting with, all right, hey, everybody, I know we've been rushing around. We're just going to close our eyes and take 3 deep breaths. That's a spiritual moment. We're connecting with our spirit in those moments of, like, we're slowing down. There's something bigger than us called silence and breath. So we can use spiritual intimacy. And we can also use experiential intimacy. When we go through a journey together, you create a bond. Like, you've got a project that requires an extra lift and everybody agrees, yeah, we've got the capacity to work late into the night, and you're ordering pizzas, and you get through and you deliver to the deadline. Like, you've now had this bonding experience, and that's a way to build intimacy as well. So there are all of these different levers that you can pull to create intimacy. And it's, how do you create how do you use them situationally appropriately, so that in work I'm using the right forms of intimacy, in my friendships I'm using the right form, at home I'm using the right form, etc.
Yeah. And then, yeah, as you said, let's say, when people get their lines or their wires crossed when it comes to intimacy, where you might just be seeking, you just want a hug. Sometimes
Mhm.
you just want that connection, and it can come across as, people tend to
Yeah.
hypersexualize the situation, and all you're looking for was that physical connection,
Mhm.
and that degree of intimacy, but there is nothing sexualized about it.
Right.
And it's about how do you have that conversation, let's say, if especially if, let's say, from a, a male perspective, like when it comes to women, they're more likely to hang out
Mhm.
and hug and be, let's say, more physically close,
Yeah.
but you might get like a bear hug or a handshake at most from
Right.
the macho men kind of mentality.
Yeah.
So how do is it a cultural thing, or is it a matter of trying to uh, break down that barrier with your closest friends, and try to normalize it?
Yeah. I mean, the cultural specter that's hanging out there is homophobia, right? Men can't hug men without being called homophobic slurs, and that's the tough one, right? That's going to take a long time for that to go away. Women, for whatever reason, is not seen as a homophobic move for a woman to hug another woman. And then there's the risk of a man hugging a woman. It becomes hypersexualized. So we have to pick and choose around physical intimacy where are the right places to do that. And there's a book on burnout. It was actually written for Burnout for Women. It was one of the inspirations I had for writing my book, by Emily and Amelia Nagoski. And in it, they break down the scientific studies that show 7 key ways that we process stress in our bodies. So their book is called Burnout, Ending the Stress Cycle, or something like that. And when we encounter a stress event, we get through the stressful moment, but we don't necessarily deal with the stress afterwards. So like we had the project deadline and we were under the gun at work and we got the proposal delivered on time, but we didn't deal with all the stressful moments that happened in the preceding weeks to work them out. And there are 7 ways that we can do that. One of them is hugs or physical affection, like having a 20-second hug with somebody. It's like a full body hug, non-sexual, actually releases stress from our systems. Like this has been physiologically studied. And so we have these tools, but we have all these social barriers that say, well, you're not allowed to use that tool, not with this person, not in that situation. So then we need to find out, okay, well, what are the other tools that we can use? Exercise is a great way to get that stress cycle completed. Laughter, crying, creative expression. So there's all these different tools. Just like with intimacy, there are different forms of intimacy we can use. So educating ourselves about like what are these really deep systemic level tools that we can use to combat burnout, um, and then start to say, okay, which one do I apply? I don't just have one tool. I don't go to just physical intimacy and I hug everybody. That's how I deal with my stress. That would be a little crazy, but I've got this range of different strategies that I can use.
Yeah. Um, Again, it's kind of like just adding tools to the toolbox, and obviously not using all of them at once, but finding which tool is most suitable to that task or to that specific uh, job.
Yeah, burnout. We got into burnout, and we get into burnout by making thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of decisions over a number of years. It's really complex. There's no simple solution. We can't just say to everybody, do this one thing and your burnout will go away. It's systemic and the at the structural level, but for individuals, like we just need a bunch of different tools. We need to know like, oh, right now this is the thing that I need to do. I need to go get a hug from somebody. I need to go laugh. I need to connect with spirit, whatever it might be, and have that flexibility.
Yeah, I suppose just one other aspect, let's say, of the intimacy is, like, we've defined how intimacy is different from engagement, but what do you mean by expansive intimacy?
Yeah, just what we've been talking about is that not only are there multiple forms of intimacy and different ways to practice it, but that we can have access to it in every sphere of our life. And when I have intimacy, as I do today, with a romantic partner, with my colleagues, with my friends, with my children, I have all of these places to have the outlets for expressing myself, for dealing with life when it gets hard, for celebrating when things are going well. And so the stress can't build up like it used to. I still am burnout prone. I still want to achieve like crazy, but I have all these people who care for me and look out for me and will listen to me when I've got something that feels hard, and I can share it without going into shame again. So that's really the essence of expansive intimacy.
The whole concept, it's a major shift compared to what I experienced over my recovery journey. It was all about engagement and seeking that social connection and
Yeah.
connecting with others. And I suppose another aspect, especially in my recovery, was that like I'm I'm very introverted, and
Mhm.
because like I even know from when I was younger, I would have been I was definitely a hugger. As a kid running around the yard, I was always a
Sure.
hugger, and for that I had every homophobic slur thrown at me at the age of 7 or 8, and I
Yeah.
was like, look, this is just how I was. But like social pressures kind of uh, told me to quieten down and not
Mhm.
express myself that way.
Yeah.
Um, so then as I got older, as I went into my teenage years in college, I was less of a hugger, and it was like, oh, is he just kind of like socially awkward, or let's say not socially inept to
Yeah.
hugging. and
Mhm.
and and even then it was, let's say, through my family. If I said, oh, I went for a night out with the lads, had a few beers, and I hugged them before I left on the way home, they'd be like, how many drinks did you have if you were hugging the guys? It was like, you must have been wasted. And so it was like, um
Uh,
it was drilled into me at such a deep level that it was like, how dare you hug someone on a night out? I got to such a deep level of introversion that it was, people thought that, oh, Eugene can't form a connection with people. It wasn't that I didn't want to form a connection. It was that I'd been put down so many times for trying to have a deeper connection with people,
yeah.
that instead of trying to seek a deeper connection with everyone, I just had, let's say, a very close circle. And that it was that it wasn't that I was introverted and I didn't want to spend time with anyone. It was that I had a smaller circle of friends, and they were the only ones that I sought that connection with.
Yeah.
And they were the only one. Let's say I had a very personal, a kind of a deeper, of course, a more intimate relationship with those friends, because I was able to connect with them on a deeper level, and be more
Mhm.
open about my emotions. And there was nothing sexual about it. It was all about just being able to express myself as I was.
Yeah.
And it's trying to get people to understand
Mm.
that there's, again, it's just that hypersexualization of the concept of intimacy, and it's trying to
Yeah.
have that conversation with people to get them to be more, let's say, expressive, and
Mhm.
to be more vulnerable, and to have
Mhm.
those conversations that need to be had. And I think that, again, that brings it back to why I started this podcast in the first place, was to help open that discussion,
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
destigmatize the whole mental health in the workplace, and get people to be vulnerable and reach out if they do need that help. Um, and I guess this is just a starting point. And it's great having guests like you on the show to bring that out as well, and to help people have that conversation.
I love that you're creating the space, Eugene, that these are the conversations we need to have to let people know that they're not alone in whatever they're feeling, whether it's social shyness, introversion, which I'm an introvert as well. If it's burnout, it's this redefinition of who we get to be instead of all these pressures that we're told to live up to, of like, this expectation, that expectation. I want people to be themselves, and expansive intimacy is designed to be flexible. Your version of it's not going to look like mine. It's not going to look like somebody else's. It's that, can we just all open up ourselves a little bit more And yeah, again, I just love that you're creating this space for the conversations that help us move that forward.
Yeah, 100%. And it's I'm grateful to have other people out there. Like when I first had this vision to open the discussion, I felt like first I was only releasing solo episodes and kind of solo casts because I wasn't sure. I thought it was a very niche topic and that people didn't want to have that discussion. And then I said at the start of this year, I was like, hang on a second, I got some feedback of people who are interested. Maybe there are more people out there who want to have that discussion, but no one has reached out to them to see if they're open to that discussion. And by simply doing that, by reaching out and saying, hey, this is my vision, this is what I'm doing. If you resonate with this, reach out to me. I'd love to have you on the show.
Yeah.
And first, I threw it out there, and it was kind of like radio silence for about 6 weeks. And next thing, the messages started coming in, and I started piling in, being like, I would love to talk about this story. I would love to. I love your vision. And I was like, okay, it's like first of all, they're hearing like my story, and they're going to hear, of course, Jim's story, and so many other stories that they're obviously if they resonated with mine. Some people resonated with mine, and I know others haven't. But they were like, you know
Yeah.
what, I respect you for having your opinion and for speaking up about it. And I was
Mhm.
like, if I can affect at least one person, that's enough for me. But the
Yeah.
fact that there's messages piling in, and I'm like, okay, this is definitely a topic that people need to have a discussion about. And
Mhm.
even on top of that, beyond the positive feedback I've gotten, I've also gotten a lot of backlash.
Yep.
And first, like I thought that when I first gained the backlash, people were like, oh, is that going to stop you from releasing content? And I was like, if anything, it fueled the fire even more. Because
Mhm.
if I'm getting backlash, they're the people who don't want you having the conversation. And whether that's
Yeah.
their own vulnerability or discomfort with the subject and that they need to be more open with it, or the fact that they're ignorant of the topic and they don't want people speaking up.
Mhm.
And maybe they need to increase their awareness of how it's affecting them and others around them.
Yeah.
It gave me all the more reason to keep fighting the good fight and be like, you know what, all the more reason to get this message out there.
Yeah. 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 Keep doing it. We need it.
All right, Jim. So, if any of our listeners want to hear more about expansive love and your burnout coaching, what's the best way for them to find you?
Best way to find anything about me is through my website, thecenteredcoach.com. You can find out about the book. You can find about my coaching services. I do a lot of writing that's up there as well. And yeah, again, thank you so much for having me on today, Eugene.
Of course, it's great to have you, Jim, and I hope to have you on again.
Cheers.
Well, I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Give Yourself Some Leeway. And if you did, please rate and review wherever you're listening to this. It makes the podcast more easily found. And if you got value from today's episode, please share with family, friend, or a loved one, because they may benefit from it just as much as you did. If you have any questions or any feedback on the topic, or maybe ideas for future episodes, you can reach out to me at giveyourselfsomeleeway.com or send me an email, eugene@leeway.ie. I read everything myself and usually respond within a day or so. So yeah, I look forward to hearing from you, and I hope you have a great day, and we'll talk soon.